My apologies. That again, I clicked on the wrong thing. So this will be lecture 2, part 2 for week 11. And I was just about to say that Philip IV was having problems. He had been for a long time in a series of battles with England and other neighboring countries, and he needed more funds. Now, I'll later be talking about the so-called 100 Years' War between France and England. But France and England have been fighting off and on since the later 12th century. It's an ongoing conflict. And Philip said, I've taxed my nobles about as much as I can. I need to find more funds. Church lands have remained untaxed. If I just tax church lands, that will offer me the funds to continue my campaigns. After all, I'm defending church lands as well. So he started taxing church lands. And Boniface, as a newly elected pope, said, no, you cannot do that. You are thereby interfering in the internal affairs of France. And this conflict went back and forth. There was actually an Augustinian hermit, whom you'll hear more about later, I think, not in this lecture, but next lecture, named Aegidius Romanus, or Giles of Rome, who had been friends with, or at least colleagues with, Benedict Gaetani. And Giles ended up writing the treatise supporting and defending Boniface's election to the papacy on the right to resign the papacy, both theologically and legally. And so Giles really was supporting Boniface, and that was going to be important for, as I said, what I'll be talking about in the next lecture for the Augustinian hermits. But he was also part of named Philip IV by Philip IV, the Archbishop of Bourges in France. So he was one of the major leading archbishops in France. He was an Augustinian hermit, and he was close with the Pope. And he had to take sides in this debate, and he sided with Boniface all the way through. And we'll see, again, the implications of that more in the next lecture. So it goes back and forth, and I won't go into all the details. But the French and also some of Philip IV's advisors started really going after Boniface as well, teaming up with the Colonna cardinals, the Italian Colonna cardinals, saying we can get rid of this guy. And they even started circulating fake papal bulls in France, that they made up these papal bulls with claims that they said Boniface was making that Boniface never really made. They had kind of come to an agreement on the issue of taxation, and Boniface saying, yeah, in cases of extreme need, the church lands can be taxed, but you need to have my permission for it first. But anyway, it kept going back and forth. And finally, Philip said, that's enough. We need to get rid of this pope. And this brings us to the debacle at Anagni in 1301. And so Philip sent a delegation of some troops and some of his major advisors leading his troops to go to Rome and to capture Boniface and to bring him back to France to try him for heresy. After all, the French king was known as the most Christian king. And he viewed himself as ruling directly for God, and here was this illegitimate pope interfering. So that's what they did. There's a small contingent across the Alps, and Boniface actually at the time was in his family estates in Anagni, which is outside of Rome. And there's where they found him. And the stories have come down to us. They found him in his family residence, which at that time had become the papal residence in Anagni, in bed. And a few of them went into the bedroom. Boniface got up, supposedly, and opened his nightshirt and said, here it is, go ahead, take it. Meaning, go ahead, cut off my head. And the commander of the troop said, what do we do now? Do we just lop off his head and get it over and done with? But we need to, we're supposed to capture him and take him back. What do we do here? Well, that was going on. The citizens of Anagni, who had supported Boniface and his family, rallied and came to the defense and started attacking the French contingent, whereby the commander in Boniface's bedroom thought, wait a minute, we have to go out and lead my troops because we're getting our butts kicked, actually. So they left Boniface there. They went back, and the citizens were able to repel the contingent of troops from France, send them back to France, and they basically failed. They went and they essentially mugged the Pope without bringing him back and capturing him, without really settling the issue. Now, this caused a scandal throughout Europe. Even Dante, the Italian poet Dante, was scandalized. So when I say even Dante, because Dante hated Boniface VIII. And in his Purgatorio, or in his Inferno, I think he placed Boniface like in the 6th or 7th circle of hell. That's what he thought of Boniface. But you don't attack the Pope. It's this distinction between the person and the office. You have respect for the office, and out of respect for the office, you don't go and treat the Pope as a common criminal, or even as a noble criminal, which doesn't mean you can't prosecute, which doesn't mean you have to like the Pope or anything else, but you just don't do that to the Pope. So there was conflict and shock that this was a step too far. Well, Boniface, having survived the attempt, supposedly went out, absolved all the citizens from any crime that they may have committed coming to his defense, returned to Rome, and died. I mean, again, he was an old man anyway, and this event shook him greatly. So there had to be a new election. And so this is in 1303 is when he dies. But before he died, he goes back to Rome and he says, we need to settle this issue, the issue between a king of France and the Pope. Now, I think I mentioned before in previous lectures, the issue was the Pope is in charge of spiritual affairs, and the emperor, and therefore by extension, the kings and princes are in charge of temporal affairs. This body-soul split. But the Pope could say, well, yes, but in causa peccati, in the cases of sin, we rule. So if it's a sin to come and mug the Pope, which certainly would have been seen as such, we can intervene. Now, this was the basis for the Pope's intervening in politics all along, in causa peccati, in the case of sin. But Boniface says we need to really clarify this, because this went beyond anything previous, any of the conflicts previous. And he says, okay, what are we going to do about this? He calls together a council in Rome. A lot of people came in, including Giles of Rome. And they condemned the French attack, but didn't really do much else. And so Boniface, they left in November 1302, and Boniface kind of felt that he had been left on his own, and he had to take matters into his own hands. And so he sat down to write a declaration, a statement, official statement. And he had on his desk a treatise sent to him by his friend and close colleague, Giles of Rome. This treatise was titled On Ecclesiastical Power. Boniface used Giles's treatise as the basis for his bull. Now, there was also another Augustinian hermit named James of Viterbo, who had followed Giles as a professor at Paris, who had also written a treatise on the Christian kingdom and the Christian rule, also sent to Boniface. So with these two treatises, Boniface composed what probably is the most famous and infamous papal bull of the Middle Ages, with the name or title Unam Sanctam. And in Unam Sanctam, what Boniface did was proclaim that every Christian has to be directly subject to the Pope for salvation. That meant King of France too, Philip. Now, in some ways, Unam Sanctam didn't make any more claims than had Gregory VII in the investiture controversy with Henry IV, and with his Dictatus Papae, which I think I mentioned. If I didn't, I should have. But the Dictatus Papae was a series of statements made by Gregory VII. We're not sure really how they were used. It's been argued that they were like a wish list, but they never became official doctrine. But with Unam Sanctam, Boniface made papal supremacy the official doctrine. Not infallibility, we'll get to that, but papal supremacy. That upset a lot of people, including Philip, and that is what led to the attack on Boniface. I should have put that, and I kind of inverted the order, because Unam Sanctam was what immediately led to the attack. So that was what was going on there. Yeah, so just to get the chronology correct. Conflict with Philip IV. Boniface then says we have to deal with this, calls the council, blah, 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 issues Unam Sanctum in late 1302. It sent reverberations throughout Europe. Philip says we have to deal with it, this renegade false pope. And then early in 1303 sends this contingent. They mug Boniface. He goes back to Rome and dies. So that's kind of the case, what we're dealing with there. With the death of Boniface, certainly things didn't change much, even though there was a lull. And there was a pope was elected, Benedict the 11th or something. I don't really remember, who didn't really survive very long. So there had to be another election. And in 1305, finally, an election took place, and they elected Clement. I don't remember his name before he became pope, but Clement V. Clement, as you can tell by the name, was French, or at least had French background. And of course, this is the time with the King of France, Philip IV, being in control in some ways. And the political conflicts in Rome were still going on between the various factions and fighting factions and families. And so Clement in 1309 said, I'm getting out of here. I'm moving to Avignon. Now, Avignon was north of the Alps. It's a French city. Technically, it was not part of the Kingdom of France, but yet it was close to the Kingdom of France. And on the one hand, this was no major deal at the time, because popes could move anywhere, and that was part of the job. The Pope is the universal head of the church. This would be a conflict, which I'll get, a source of conflict later on, which I'll get to. So just the fact that he left Rome and went to Avignon is not that big of a deal. But he started really setting up shop in Avignon and never went back. And the popes, after Clement, stayed in Avignon. And I'll talk about this at the end, but it became known as the Avignonese papacy from 1309 to 1377. So there was a whole generation, 68 years, where the Pope was not in Rome, but in Avignon. Now, that caused problems. The Renaissance humanist Petrarch, who's been seen as the father of Renaissance humanism, referred to this as the Babylonian captivity of the church. Later, I'll talk about Augustinus of Ancona, who claimed that the Pope was obligated to reside in Rome, because after all, the Pope is, among everything else that the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. And a bishop needs to reside in his diocese. The problem of non-resident bishops had been an ongoing one that even Gregory VII was dealing with, because, again, bishops, as I think I mentioned, bishops and archbishops, were often seen as and acted as just noblemen. And that's what they wanted to be, and that's how they acted, and didn't want to deal with, the mundanity of dealing with confessions and baptisms and marriages and preaching. So they would just be named bishop or archbishop, but they would just live where they wanted to live and do what they wanted to do, and hire priests to do their functions. And that's not saying that every bishop or archbishop was that way, but it was certainly there. So the whole point is the non-residency of bishops was a known problem. And here all of a sudden we have the Pope as a non-resident bishop, as well as being Pope. What do we do about it? It was a major problem. But that is where we're continuing, and the whole move to Avignon was made only worse by one of Clement's successors, who took the name of John the 22nd, and Pope John the 22nd, who ended up moving the entire papal apparatus to Avignon and began building the papal palace, which is still there. And really not just, moving to Avignon, but establishing the papacy in Avignon. John the 22nd is quite a figure. Also seen as one of the bad popes or whatever, but he was a brilliant administrator and a brilliant canon lawyer, as had Boniface been. There's also this tension between the canon lawyers and the theologians, blah, 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 blah. But how did he come about and what was going on at all at the time? And this takes us back then to before Clement's death. Um, because Clement and Robert of Anjou, who was the king of Naples, after Clement's elected and everything, realizing the problem, also realizing the potential threat of new conflict with the emperor Henry VII, made a plan, at least to alleviate the problem with the emperor. Says, okay, we have a plan. We're going to get rid of the Holy Roman Emperor. How are we going to do that? Well, when the current emperor, Henry VII, dies, we will make sure that there is not another imperial election. So if we can prevent the election, we'll prevent anybody from becoming emperor. That was plan A. Plan B was, if we can't pull that off, then we will absolutely insist that whomever is elected has to come to Rome has to come to Avignon to be sanctioned and crowned by the Pope. That is, Robert said. So that was the plan. Everything was going fine. And Robert did have reason to worry. Robert is the king of Naples, which his family had come into power there during the Sicilian Vespers in the later 13th century. Also, his title was King of Jerusalem, the Crusader state in Jerusalem as well, and of Anjou was obviously a French duchy, but it was technically underneath the empire, not the King of France. So he was technically a vassal of the King of France, at least for his duchy, even though he was King of Naples himself. He was known also as he was the papal vicar in Italy, so in some ways he was responsible for the military arm of the papacy to enforce papal policy and everything. So that was the basis of his scheming with Clement. And in I forget when it started, 1312 to 1313, Henry VII said, there's a problem. I'm worried about all this. I need to try. Number one, I want to get the Duchy of Anjou back under the crown. So, what he said, I'm going to do, because he was acting, Robert was acting independently. He said Robert never had come to court to the emperor to do homage for his duchy. So I'm going to assert and tell Robert that he needs to come to do homage to me for his Duchy of Anjou. Not for the King of Naples, but for Anjou. And Robert said, when he got the notice, he said, you got to be kidding me, man. I'm King of Naples. I'm not going to, do homage to the emperor. You got to be kidding me. I'm king of my own kingdom. This caused a real crisis. What do we do about this? So Robert is thumbing his nose at the emperor. Henry VII is saying, you need, as a vassal of mine, need to come to do homage. Robert's refusing. Well, the issue was this. According to Henry, a rebellious vassal, which Robert was being, a rebellious vassal is, by that very fact, illegitimate, and therefore his lands were forfeit. So Emperor Henry VII proclaimed Robert of Anjou as a rebellious vassal, that his lands were forfeit, and called for his head. It's a reward for anyone who could bring him the head of Robert of Anjou. He said, before I get there first. And Henry then invaded Italy to go get Robert. And this was in 1314. Robert at first is like, go ahead. But when Henry invades, crosses the Alps, it's like, oh my God, what do I want to do now? Do I really want to go to war with the emperor? Well, history has a lot of chance in it. And just by chance, Henry VII and his army, when they were just a little outside or near Rome, all of a sudden Henry died. So wait a minute, how that was just struck down by divine vengeance? Well, maybe one way, but interpreted in one way. But the point was, they had camped in a bed of malaria. Malaria was rampant in the summer. Boniface had to deal with malaria. That's why he went to Anagni. And Henry, not knowing, he and his whole camp made camp. He and his whole forces made camp and was kind of wiped out by malaria. So all of a sudden, Robert was like, "Whoo!" and dodged that bullet, and we now have a chance. Emperor is dead. We can put our plan in place and prevent the next imperial election. So, Clement, let's do this. Problem was, Clement had died. Now, Clement was an Emil. Clement had died. 1314, we have two vacancies, an imperial vacancy and a papal vacancy. Both have to be chosen, elected. Now, this gets to be a major problem, but the emperors got together and actually elected Frederick of Austria as emperor. You don't see Frederick's name up there. He was important, but there was a number of electors who claimed, no, we didn't want to vote for Frederick of Austria. So we're going to vote again. We were coerced to vote for Frederick, and so we're going to vote again, and we voted for Louis, Duke of Bavaria, as emperor. So Louis, Duke of Bavaria, became emperor. Frederick was emperor. There was a split election. Frederick was older, and he said, okay, I'll just stay, and I'll be emperor here, and you can go and be emperor in the world. I'm not going to worry about it too much. The point was, Louis of Bavaria was acting as emperor, at least internationally. Problem was, there was no pope, so they couldn't even put Plan B into effect. Obviously, they failed with Plan A. Well, the emperors elected two candidates, but the College of Cardinals couldn't elect anybody. Went back and forth. There was a papal vacancy for 2 years. Finally, in 1316, with the influence of Robert of Anjou, because he finally made the suggestion. He says, why don't you appoint my former court chaplain, who was the Archbishop of Amiens, Jacques de Cahors. He's old. He won't last all that long. He's a good guy. I can vouch for him. Just choose him, and then we'll, again, can figure it out. And they did. Once again, a quote-unquote compromise choice. Problem was, Jacques de Cahors, who took the name John the 22nd, was a very feisty, crusty old man, and he lived on and on and on. And he becomes Pope, and he starts putting things in order. And there is renewed conflict, especially with when he comes into office of the papacy. This guy, Louis, Duke of Bavaria, running around pretending he's Pope, who had not come to him. So there's a whole series of letters going back and forth between Louis of Bavaria, and John the 22nd, where they're just like Gregory the VII and Henry IV. John the 22nd writes to Louis of Bavaria and is like, dear Louis, Duke of Bavaria, who's pretending to be emperor. And Louis would write back to the Pope saying, dear Jacques de Cahors, who's pretending to be Pope, back and forth in terms of what is this. And Louis is like, I'm not going to come and do homage to you. You got to be crazy. So this is the whole issue of this ritual ceremony of homage, vassalage. And just as the problem between Henry VII and Robert of Anjou was a crisis for medieval political theory in terms of the feudal system and how does that all work, so was this in terms of the papacy and the emperor. So, to make a long story short, the fights between John and Louis went back and forth. Louis sending troops to fight against John, and John has been estimated spent 2/3 of his income on troops to fight against Louis. John had excommunicated, of course, Louis and also the North Italian cities who had been supporting Louis. In 1328, it was Louis invaded Rome, and I know I'm not going chronologically because the story is too detailed and exciting, and I'm kind of skipping over things. But by that time, he camped up in Milan, in Pavia, which was the imperial residence in Pavia, in northern Italy, and turned out to be as bad of an overlord for the North Italian cities as they viewed John. So they kind of switched sides and expelled John. But Louis did go to Rome and did establish an anti-pope, another pope, Nicholas V, which had some support. So there was some support for Louis as Emperor Louis of Bavaria and his Pope, Nicholas V. But by and large, most people had continued to follow John the 22nd, who was in Avignon. There's this split a little bit. But once Boniface is repelled and goes back north, and he never goes back into Italy, and the support for Nicholas falls by the wayside. So John escapes that problem. But there had been before Louis invaded continued problems. And that also was based on Louis of Bavaria's calling for a church council to deal with a heretical pope, claiming that John the 22nd was a heretic. In 1324, this is with papal infallibility, the Franciscans and Louis of Bavaria's Sachsenhausen appeal. In 1324, Emperor Louis of Bavaria issued a document which is known as the Sachsenhausen Appeal. It's called the Sachsenhausen Appeal because Sachsenhausen was a town in Germany from where it was issued. And here he's calling on the German nobles and all nobles to get together and have a church council to try John the 22nd for heresy. Included in this document, not written by Louis, but what scholars say is an anonymous Franciscan, because that was another thing that John did. He condemned Franciscan poverty. I'll get back to that in a second. But this anonymous Franciscan, the scholars have tried to identify who it is and have not been able to come up with a solution that really makes a lot of sense, whereby consensus could be. This is called the Franciscan Insert, because some Franciscan wrote part of the Sachsenhausen Appeal. Now, at the time, it was not known that this was a Franciscan insert, that Louis had gotten this text from a Franciscan and put it into a Sachsenhausen Appeal, because it went out there as an official imperial document. But what is this Franciscan insert, and why was Franciscans involved? In 1323, John the 22nd condemned the Franciscan understanding of poor use. The Franciscans had been, from Francis, which I talked about in the previous lecture, become very popular, and it was based on them following literally Christ. Naked and poor following the naked and poor Christ. And they claim that we will own nothing individually or corporately. That's a big distinction. Part of the monastic vows going all the way back, poverty, chastity, and obedience. You vowed to be poor. But what the Franciscans did said, we're not just going to be poor individually. We're going to be poor as an order. Our order is not going to own anything, but we can use things. Distinction between use and ownership. It's still there. It's called usus fructus. You can donate if you're wealthy. You can donate to the university. You can donate your entire estate. So I'm not anywhere near that wealthy. But let's say I was worth $10 million, I'm not anywhere near that. I'm not near half of that or a tenth of that. But that's another issue. If I were to give $10 million to the university, an estate worth $10 million, nice house, all this other stuff, I could arrange, if I didn't have any heirs, or if I didn't want to have my heirs inherit, I could arrange with the university that I would give them my estate, but I would retain the use of it until my death. That's called usus fructus in Latin. I would have the fruits of it, or the use of it, even though the ownership of the fruits were with the university. Well, here, that was what the Franciscans were doing. And it's the usus, and then dominium. Dominium is the Latin for ownership, or lordship. So what they claimed is that the church would own all of our lands. We would just use them. Now, that is a fine distinction. In practice, it doesn't make much of a difference. And John recognized this. He said, these Franciscans are becoming too powerful and too wealthy anyway. They're becoming pretty uppity. They're also claiming that they are the most perfect form of Christian perfection. The most perfect form of Christian perfection is living as a Franciscan. And John the 22nd is like, wait a minute, I am Pope. Do they realize what they're saying is that they are, by implication, logically, more perfect than the Pope? Now, the term perfect, perfectus or perfectum in Latin, does not necessarily mean perfect in the sense that we think, oh, that's the perfect view of it or form of it, in that could not be better. It just means complete. But still, the most complete, perfect form of Christian life being the Franciscan life, they're saying that any Franciscan is more perfect than I am as Pope. So what John the 22nd does in 1323 is to condemn that statement, to condemn the statement that Christ and the apostles owned no property. John said that was the basis for the Franciscan ideal. Look, Christ and the apostles didn't own anything, and we're going to actually literally imitate Christ. John came back and said, no, you know what? Christ did own things. He owned everything. He is, the Lord of all. Otherwise, when he goes and takes the corn, that's stealing. When he tells his disciples to go get the donkey, that's stealing. He didn't tell his disciples, go and find the donkey and ask its owner if we can borrow it. He said, go, and he said, the Lord needs it. He's taking it. Christ, Jesus, is Lord of everything. He owns everything. As vicar of Christ, but that statement that Christ and the apostles own no property, John the 22nd said that is an heretical statement. That's not what the scriptures are saying. Fine. His Cum Inter Nullos bull of 1323. That too was an outrage. It's like, oh my God, what? The Franciscans, the very foundation of their way of life and their ideals, had just been condemned by the Pope. That was seen as a heretical statement. That was what then Louis, who's trying to get rid of John, teams up with the Franciscans, which is not just a bunch of spiritual people and mendicants running around. It's also, bishops and cardinals and everything else that are involved to get rid of John. And this Franciscan insert made the following argument. This Franciscan insert into the Sachsenhausen Appeal of 1324. The argument was this. Pope Nicholas III, in his bull Exii of 1231, had already proclaimed the Franciscan way of life as the highest form of Christian perfection. John the 22nd just condemned that. Since what a pope states officially as a position of faith on faith and morals is an infallible decree, Nicholas III's statement was an infallible decree. John the 22nd just condemned an infallible decree, which is condemning the truth. Only an antichrist could do that. Now, popes have been called antichrist before. It was pretty strong critique. We'll see it again later in the course. But it was a personal attack. And John the 22nd, when he read this, said, so what? This is a joke. There's no precedent in canon law, in church law, for the Pope being infallible. This was ridiculous. And actually, Brian Tierney put this all together. So this is the first instance we have of papal infallibility, the argument of papal infallibility. Moreover, John would say, that's insane. I'm not infallible. Number one. Number two, I wouldn't want to be infallible, because that means I'm limited to the bozo decisions of my predecessors. I'm not infallible as Pope. I am supreme in Pope. So I have the supreme authority and power to say the way things are, even if that is not infallible. Now, you could laugh. You could dismiss it as ridiculous, and legally it was very spurious. But it was still in an imperial document. That was 1324. Also in 1324 came out a treatise. It was the most radical treatise, political treatise of the Middle Ages, Marsilius Appadua's Defender of the Peace, 1324, which argued, also using Franciscan arguments, that the papacy should be abolished, that the papacy is strictly a human institution. The priesthood is essential to a Christian state. The priesthood is essential. But the hierarchy within the priesthood is not. That is a human construct. And this led to all kinds of political theories. I get frustrated here because I've written a fair amount about all of this, and I know a fair amount about it, and I'm having to just kind of hit the major points, and it's kind of difficult. But the point being here is that Marsilius of Padua in 1324 argued for the abolition of the papacy, and that the emperor or the ruler, it gets more complicated than that, is the defender of the peace and is responsible for keeping the peace and for governing. And the clergy, the priesthood, are servants of the state. They're civil servants, just like the police, just like the garbage collectors, and anyone else in the military, anybody else that works for the state. The priesthood is one of those essential offices, but not the papacy and not the hierarchy. Dedicates it to Louis. That goes out there. So John the 22nd in 1324 is hit with this double barrel shot with Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis, or Defender of the Peace, and with Louis of Bavaria's Sachsenhausen Appeal. What does he do? Well, he turns to the Augustinians. Giles of Rome, the Augustinian hermit, had supported Boniface. Well, Augustinus of Ancona ended up supporting John. And in 1326, I'm sorry, here on the slide, it is very wrong. It has 1324. Augustinus of Ancona, Summa de Potestate Ecclesiastica. That's not 1324. It should be 1326. My apologies. Please keep that or note that, because Augustinus is replying to Marsilius, even though he doesn't cite Marsilius, but it's clear that he is, and this is what I've argued and shown. And Augustinus comes to the defense of John in what is the most comprehensive treatment of papal power and ecclesiastical power of the time, going far beyond even Giles of Rome in terms of the extent. And what Augustinus does is try to explore the limits of papal power. He argues, can the Pope empty purgatory? He says, yeah, Pope can empty purgatory, because the Pope has all the power of Christ. As the vicar of Christ, he has all the power of Christ. The problem is, he doesn't have all the knowledge of Christ. So if the Pope were to empty purgatory, which he can do, he would be in error. He would err, because he would not have the basis of the knowledge of doing that. No one can judge the Pope except for Christ. Can there be bad popes? Absolutely. There's been bad popes all along. Are Christians obligated to follow a bad pope? Yes. You have to follow a bad pope. You don't follow a heretical pope. So if the pope is fallen into heresy, the pope is, by that very fact, no longer pope. So you don't follow someone who's not pope. So the question is the pope heretical? Another question Augustinus deals with, does the Pope have to reside in Rome? He says, no, the Pope can reside anywhere. The Pope is head of the Universal Church. He says, but based on the Pope being the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, even by necessity, must live in Rome. Now, John loved this treatise and sent Augustinus 100 gold florins to say, keep writing books for me. Augustinus of Ancona was the chaplain of Robert of Anjou. He obviously didn't read it carefully enough, because John the 22nd was an Amiens, and here this treatise, in this long, lengthy scholastic treatise with various questions going pro and con, said, okay, yes, the Pope can live anywhere, but as bishop of his flock, he has to live in Rome. John, you're an Amiens. John, be careful. You can do anything, basically, but if you don't have the knowledge, you are going to pay for it. No one can judge you, but you will go to hell if you abuse your office. He says, and here too, Augustinus asks, is the Pope infallible? Responding to the Sachsenhausen Appeal without citing it. And his answer is, he is infallible as long as he doesn't err. So, as long as he doesn't make a mistake, he's infallible. So we have a fallible, infallible Pope with Augustinus of Ancona. He's making these fine scholastic distinctions. But John just thought this was great. Obviously, as I said, didn't really read it carefully enough. And the debate just continues. John turned to another Augustinian, the prior general of the Augustinian order, to refute Marsilius's Defender of the Peace. And on that basis condemns Marsilius's Defender of the Peace in 1328, just as Louis is invading. So it gets to be a real mess, and it's continued shock. There was really no solution. And we'll see the political problems continuing with the papacy and the emperor or princes and everything else for the rest of the later Middle Ages. So this is what's going on here. And as this is going on, there's other forms of crises that are arising and will soon be hitting. As the debates between Philip the Fourth and Boniface, and then Louis of Bavaria and John the 22nd, a famine breaks out in Northern Europe. And this is the next slide: famine and plague. The Great Northern Famine, 1317 to 1322. So yeah, this is after the time of Boniface. And it is not everywhere, but it was a major famine. As never before. There have been periods of hunger, but not famine. Famine. I am assuming here that none of us here today has experienced famine. I mean, we've been hungry. We've been malnourished, gone without meals, but not famine. Famine is when you die of starvation. And that was what was happening in Northern Europe after a series of crop failures, heavy rains. When the food supply is gone, you can get by with 1 year or 2 years, but then 3 years it becomes horrific. And people start asking, why is this happening? And there are cases or stories of cannibalism. Why? Well, if you are, head of a household, husband or wife, with kids, you're all starving, and your spouse dies from hunger. You know your kids are maybe have another day left. What do? Do you eat that spouse, that dead spouse, to save your kids? It's a horrible situation to be in. I can't really imagine it. But the point being, that was the severity of this famine. Nothing like this had happened. There have been periods of hunger or crop failures and things, but not to this extent and this level. Now, it ends in 1322. You can recover from famine if you can survive, if you're an adult. But let's say you were 2 years old in 1317, and you have then this period of 5 years of famine conditions where you barely are able to survive. If you're 2 years old, then you're 7 years old. Those are important years of child development. So in some ways, your whole rest of your life is affected based on your malnutrition and famine conditions of early on. It's been argued that led to the severity of the next epidemic or problem that was happening, which was an epidemic, namely the plague. Plague or the Black Death. Don't ever call it the Black Plague. It's not the Black Plague. It's called the Black Death or the Plague. 3 different types of plague: bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and pneumonic plague. The septicemic plague affected the bloodstream. The pneumonic plague affected the lungs, and the bubonic plague affected the lymphatic system. It's called the Black Death because of the skin discoloration that would happen. And it hits in 1347. It's carried, it's not caused by rats. It's caused actually the bacillus that is the actual plague issue. It was caused, or it was carried by rats based on the saliva of fleas and the regurgitated saliva of fleas that would bite the rats, and then it would spread. Come from the south. There had been a Justinian plague in the 6th century that was known about, but this came from the trading ports in the east because it was going in the east. And it was so virulent. And by 1349, it had killed off. By 1350, when it's kind of beginning subsiding, 1349 is the height of it, it killed an estimated at least a third of the population. And in some places, such as Florence, as much as 80%. We know what COVID was like. This was far worse than COVID. We know what, well, you may not, I lived through it. We know what AIDS had been like when that first hit. Fear, wondering, where does this come from? Same thing with COVID. What do we do about it? The plague was, in times more deadly. COVID killed a lot of people. AIDS killed a lot of people. But not at least a third of the population, or up to 80% in some places. People start asking, why is this happening? There's all kinds of issues. It really can be only seen as, apocalypticism. There must be a cause. And one answer to the cause was the Jews must be poisoning the wells because the Jews are the enemies of Christians. We know that. This is their scheme to get rid of us. And that was widely spread. We have then a new wave of anti Semitism, which was just going to get worse throughout the later Middle Ages, but it goes in waves. But Jews were dying too, so it didn't make any sense. It was seen as divine punishment. Plague is a biblical term. The plagues on Egypt, let my people go. It's that proportion they were putting it into. Must be our own faults. And there was a group known as the penitents who were saying the problem is we're not doing sufficient penance. And I'll talk more about this, I think, next lecture. So we must take it on ourselves. The priests are not doing their jobs. This is where there's a rise in anti-clericalism, not being against religion or Christianity, but being against the inferior, incompetent priests. Because if they've been doing their jobs, this wouldn't be happening. We have to do it, take it on ourselves. So they would go around whipping themselves. They were called the flagellants, go around whipping themselves to atone for their sins. The church condemned them because obviously they're critical of the institutional church. But it leads to this horrible situation of increased criticism of the ecclesiastical power, the institutional authority there, the conflict between the emperor and the pope and everything else is causing that to run amok. Death is everywhere. And then there's continued war, meaning there is this sense of apocalypticism. The world must be coming to an end. That's the only way we can explain this, because we have, obviously, poverty is always with us, but then we have famine, we have plague, we have conflict, and we also war. They have up here the war thing. This 100 Years' War breaks out in 1336, basically. But as I said before, France and England have been fighting constantly, but it doesn't mean that the war went on for 100 years. This is one of those things that it was just on and off battles for 100 years, but it had been going on for almost at least for another couple hundred years between France and England. But what happens in war? Armies come through towns. They rape, pillage, and plunder. So we add the horrors of war, the destructiveness of war, to famine and plague and death. The sense that, yeah, my God, the end of the world is at hand. These are the signs, the four horses of the apocalypse. How do we deal with this? What does it all mean? Heresy was on the rise. Crusades continued. There was a crusade against the Albigensian Crusade, against the heresy in France, the Albigensian heresy in France, which I won't go into. John the 22nd is proclaiming crusades against Louis of Bavaria. This whole problem of this period is one of conflict and not knowing what to do about it. And the political system is just going to get worse. This slide, the Great Western Schism. I'm just going to briefly mention this, and I'll come back to it next lecture. Afghanese papacy is in 1309, 1377. Pope Gregory IX, I think it was, finally said, okay, I am going to go back to Rome. So he goes back to Rome in 1377 and dies. So that's to be a new papal election in 1378. One of the things that John XXII too had done was to greatly expand the College of Cardinals and fill them with French cardinals. The people in Rome are clamoring for a Roman pope, or at least not a Roman pope, at least an Italian pope. And the cardinals got together and said, well, they're rioting. We should give them what they want. And they voted for Urban, Pope Urban. Well, the French cardinals said this is not right, because you can't, an election under duress and under compulsion is not a free election. It is not a valid election. So we are going to go back to Avignon and elect the Pope, which they do. And they elect Clement VI as Pope. So there's a split election with the papacy. The Roman Pope, Urban, and the Afghanese Pope, Clement. What do we do about it? The seamless robe of Christ had been torn. We now had two heads. Now, there had been anti-popes before. I already mentioned Nicholas V under Louis of Bavaria. But what made this so worse is that politically Europe split. So that each pope, the Afghanese pope, or Clement originally, and then Urban, the Roman Pope, had political support for their claims. So they are actually, they're both functioning as if they're the right Pope. They excommunicate the other as being a schismatic, and a schismatic is worse than a heretic. Now, if you're a follower of Urban, you don't care that you've been excommunicated by the Afghanese Pope, and vice versa. But there's this, for the normal person, it's like, what? Because if you eat to, unworthily, you eat to your death, i.e. referring to the Eucharist. And under excommunication of the ban, no sacraments were supposed to be formed, which is almost, a hell sentence. The anxiety level is through the roof. And how do we handle this? I'll be talking more about this problem next lecture. So I'm going to leave it here for now, because I probably already have gone past the time. But this is why I refer to this period as the beginning of the crumbling of Christendom, when this model, this assumed idealized model of everything fitting together, can no longer be upheld. There was always problems and tensions, as I talked about with the rise of cities and towns and the communes. But these fissures are causing earthquakes and calls for reformation in head and members, a complete reformation of the church. The institutional church in head and members has to come about. So there is calls for reformation, for change, because all of a sudden it's like our world is over. How do we deal with all this? We'll leave that here. We'll continue in the next lecture with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Thank you for your patience, and I'll see you again before long. Bye-bye.